Antique appraiser. Catherine Morse had attended hundreds of estate sales throughout her 30-year career, but the Victorian mansion on Elm Street in Salem, Massachusetts, held an unusual appeal. The Blackwood family had lived there for over a century before the last heir, elderly Margaret Blackwood, passed away with no surviving relatives. Catherine moved methodically through rooms filled with period furniture, oil paintings, and ornate decorative pieces. In the formal parlor, she discovered a collection of family photographs dating back to the 1880s, each carefully preserved in matching silver frames. Most showed the typical formal poses of Victorian-era photography, stern-faced family members arranged stiffly before painted backdrops. One photograph immediately caught her attention. The image showed what appeared to be a family of four: a distinguished gentleman with a dark beard, an elegant woman in a high-collared dress, and two children, a boy and girl, perhaps 10 and 12 years old. They were posed in their parlor, surrounded by the elaborate furnishings typical of wealthy Victorian homes. But it was the centerpiece of the room that drew Catherine's eye: an enormous crystal vase positioned on a mahogany table directly behind the family. The vase was extraordinary, easily 3 feet tall with intricate cut glass patterns that caught and reflected light beautifully. Even in the sepia tones of the old photograph, Catherine could see it was a museum-quality piece. What struck her as unusual was the photographer's choice to include so much of the room's background. Most family portraits from 1899 focused tightly on the subjects, but this image seemed deliberately composed to showcase the parlor's opulent furnishings, particularly that magnificent vase. Catherine picked up the photograph for closer examination, noting the date inscribed in faded ink on the back: Blackwood family, Christmas 1899. As she studied the image, something about the crystal vase nagged at her attention. There seemed to be shadows or reflections in its surface that didn't quite match the rest of the room. Back in her Boston workshop, Catherine scanned the Blackwood family photograph at high resolution, using the same digital enhancement equipment that had helped her authenticate countless antiques over the years. As the image appeared on her computer screen in stunning detail, she leaned forward with growing fascination. The crystal vase's cut glass surface acted like a complex mirror, capturing reflections of everything in the parlor. She could see the ornate ceiling molding, the heavy draperies, even the photographer's equipment positioned across the room. But as Catherine adjusted the image contrast and brightness, one reflection made her breath catch. There, clearly visible in the curved surface of the vase, was the figure of a person who wasn't part of the posed family. The reflection showed someone standing in the doorway behind the photographer, a tall figure in dark clothing who appeared to be watching the family portrait session. Catherine cross-referenced the reflection with the visible family members. The father, mother, and two children were all accounted for in their formal poses. The mysterious figure in the vase's reflection was definitely a fifth person, someone who had been present during the photograph but deliberately excluded from the family grouping. Even more intriguing, the person's posture suggested they were trying to remain hidden. The figure stood partially concealed by the door frame, as if observing the family without wanting to be noticed. Only the crystal vase's perfect reflective properties had captured their presence. Catherine had seen plenty of Victorian family photographs that included servants or extended family members, but they were typically positioned openly within the frame. This deliberate concealment suggested something more complex, either someone who wasn't supposed to be there, or someone the family didn't want documented in their formal portrait. She printed several enhanced versions of the photograph, each focusing on different aspects of the mysterious reflection. The figure appeared to be wearing formal attire appropriate for the period, but their face remained frustratingly obscured by shadows and the distortion inherent in the curved glass surface. Catherine realized she needed expert help to solve this puzzle. She reached for her phone to call Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a historian who specialized in 19th century American family structures and had helped her research mysterious photographs before. Dr. Warren arrived at Catherine's workshop the following morning, her scholarly excitement evident as she examined the enhanced photographs. As a specialist in Victorian-era family dynamics, she had encountered many mysteries hidden within formal family portraits, but the deliberate concealment suggested by this reflection intrigued her immensely. "This is highly unusual," Dr. Warren observed, studying the image through a magnifying glass. Victorian families were very particular about their formal portraits. They represented social status, family unity, and respectability. To have someone present but deliberately excluded suggests a significant family tension or scandal. Together, they began researching the Blackwood family history through genealogical records, newspaper archives, and Salem City directories from the 1890s. The family appeared to be pillars of the community. Charles Blackwood owned a successful textile mill, his wife Eleanor was active in various charitable organizations, and their children attended the finest private schools. But as Dr. Warren dug deeper into public records, gaps began to emerge in the family narrative. Census records from 1890 listed 5 people living in the Blackwood household, but the 1900 census showed only 4. Somewhere between those dates, someone had disappeared from the official family structure. Catherine found the first clue in a collection of newspaper society pages from 1899. A brief mention in the Salem Evening News from November of that year referenced the Blackwood family's recent family reorganization following unfortunate circumstances. The cryptic phrasing was typical of Victorian-era journalism, which avoided explicit discussion of family scandals. More revealing was a legal document Catherine discovered at the Essex County Courthouse, a petition for guardianship filed by Charles Blackwood in October 1899, just months before the family photograph was taken. The petition sought legal custody of an adult family member requiring supervision due to diminished mental capacity. "This is it," Dr. Warren said excitedly. The missing person from the household was likely an adult child or relative who had been institutionalized or placed under legal guardianship. In Victorian society, mental illness or developmental disabilities were often hidden from public view. The timing was perfect. The guardianship petition was filed just 2 months before the Christmas family portrait. Someone who had been part of the Blackwood household had been removed from the family structure, but apparently was still present in the house when the photograph was taken, watching from the shadows as their former family posed for posterity without them. Dr. Warren's expertise in Victorian-era medical and legal records proved invaluable as they traced the fate of the missing Blackwood family member. Massachusetts had been progressive in establishing state institutions for people with mental illness and developmental disabilities, but the records from these facilities were often incomplete or deliberately obscured to protect family privacy. At the Massachusetts State Archives, they found what they were looking for in the admission records of the Danvers State Hospital, a large psychiatric institution that opened in 1878. An entry dated November 15, 1899, recorded the admission of Thomas C. Blackwood, age 24, committed by family petition due to episodes of violent behavior and inability to function in society. The admission form, signed by Charles Blackwood, described Thomas as subject to fits of rage and periods of complete withdrawal from reality. The attending physician's notes painted a picture of a young man struggling with what modern medicine would likely diagnose as severe bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. But Catherine noticed something troubling in the medical records. Thomas had been described by the family as violent and dangerous, yet the hospital staff's observations told a different story. Daily logs showed him as gentle and cooperative, with no incidents of violence or aggression during his first months of confinement. "There's a disconnect here," Catherine observed. Either Thomas was putting on an act for the hospital staff, or his family exaggerated his condition to justify the institutionalization. Dr. Warren found additional context in the hospital's correspondence files. A letter from Eleanor Blackwood to the hospital director, dated December 1899, requested that Thomas not be allowed any visitors for the protection of our younger children. The letter also asked that his presence at the institution not be discussed with any outside parties. More disturbing was a financial document showing that Charles Blackwood had transferred ownership of a significant family trust fund from Thomas's name to his younger siblings just weeks before the institutionalization. In Victorian America, adult children with mental illness often lost their inheritance rights when placed under legal guardianship. "This is looking less like a medical necessity and more like a family conspiracy," Dr. Warren said grimly. Thomas may have been institutionalized not because he was dangerous, but because he was inconvenient, financially and socially. The Christmas 1899 photograph was taking on a more sinister meaning. Thomas hadn't been hiding in the doorway out of shame. He had been excluded from his own family portrait after being stripped of his legal rights and inheritance. Catherine contacted the current administration of what had once been Danvers State Hospital, now closed but with records preserved at the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health Archives. The hospital had been infamous for its poor conditions and experimental treatments, but it had also employed some progressive doctors who kept detailed patient records. Dr. Henry Morrison, who had served as Thomas Blackwood's primary physician from 1899 to 1903, had left extensive notes that painted a very different picture of the young man than his family's accusations suggested. Morrison's observations described Thomas as intelligent, articulate, and surprisingly well-educated for someone allegedly suffering from severe mental deficiency. More significantly, Morrison had documented his growing suspicions about Thomas's commitment. In a confidential report dated March 1900, Morrison wrote, "Patient exhibits no signs of the violent tendencies or mental incapacity described by his family. His periods of melancholy and anxiety appear consistent with someone grieving the loss of his freedom and family connections, rather than symptoms of inherent mental illness." Catherine found the smoking gun in Morrison's personal correspondence with a colleague at Harvard Medical School. In a letter dated June 1900, Morrison expressed his concerns directly. "I believe Thomas Blackwood has been wrongfully committed by his family for financial rather than medical reasons. His only madness appears to be his opposition to certain family business decisions that his father found inconvenient." Dr. Warren discovered what those business decisions might have been in the Salem City records. In early 1899, several months before Thomas's institutionalization, there had been a contentious city council debate about working conditions at Blackwood's textile mill. A series of anonymous letters to the Salem Evening News had accused the mill of unsafe practices and unfair wages. The anonymous correspondence stopped abruptly in November 1899, exactly when Thomas was committed to Danvers State Hospital. Thomas was the whistleblower, Catherine realized. He was trying to expose his father's business practices, so the family had him declared insane and locked away. But the most heartbreaking discovery came in Thomas's own words. Hospital records included letters he had written to family members, letters that were never sent, at his family's request. In one, addressed to his younger siblings, Thomas wrote, "I hope someday you will understand that I only wanted to help the people who work for Father. I never meant to bring shame to our family name." The reflection in the crystal vase was beginning to tell its story. Thomas Blackwood, watching helplessly as his family posed for a portrait that would preserve their respectable image while erasing his existence from their history. Catherine and Dr. Warren's investigation took a darker turn when they examined the legal proceedings that had resulted in Thomas Blackwood's commitment. The guardianship petition filed by Charles Blackwood had been suspiciously rushed through the probate court system, with minimal investigation into the validity of the mental incapacity claims. Dr. Warren found troubling connections between the Blackwood family and the officials involved in Thomas's commitment. Judge William Prescott, who had approved the guardianship petition, was a close personal friend of Charles Blackwood and a regular guest at the family's social gatherings. The two physicians who had signed the mental competency evaluation were both investors in Blackwood's textile business. This wasn't a medical decision, Dr. Warren concluded after reviewing the court documents. This was a business decision disguised as a medical necessity. Catherine discovered additional evidence in the financial records preserved at the Essex County Registry of Deeds. Thomas Blackwood had inherited a substantial trust fund from his maternal grandfather, money that was supposed to remain under his control until age 30. But the guardianship petition had transferred control of these funds to his father, who had immediately invested them in expanding the textile mill operation. More damning was a series of private letters between Charles Blackwood and his business attorney, found in the lawyer's archived papers at the Massachusetts Historical Society. In one letter dated September 1899, Charles wrote, "Thomas's idealistic notions about worker welfare threaten the profitability of our entire operation. His inheritance gives him too much independence to pursue these dangerous ideas. The guardianship proceeding will resolve both problems permanently." The attorney's response was equally revealing. "The medical testimony we have arranged should be sufficient to convince Judge Prescott of Thomas's incompetence. Once the guardianship is established, his inheritance will be safely under your control, and his ability to interfere with business operations will be eliminated." Catherine felt sick as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Thomas Blackwood hadn't been committed because he was mentally ill. He had been institutionalized because he had tried to use his wealth and social position to improve conditions for his father's workers. His own family had destroyed his life to protect their business interests. The Christmas 1899 photograph was taken just weeks after this legal conspiracy had been completed. Thomas, stripped of his rights and inheritance, had been temporarily home for the holidays before being permanently confined. The crystal vase had captured what may have been his last moment in the family home, watching from the shadows as they celebrated their victory over him. Determined to understand what Thomas Blackwood had been trying to expose, Catherine began researching the working conditions at the Blackwood textile mill in the 1890s. What she found in labor union archives and immigrant community records revealed why the family had been so desperate to silence their idealistic son. The Blackwood mill employed over 200 workers, mostly recent immigrants from Ireland and Eastern Europe who were grateful for any employment and unlikely to complain about conditions. But a series of workplace accidents in 1898 and early 1899 had begun to attract unwanted attention from labor reformers and newspaper reporters. Catherine found testimony from former mill workers preserved in the archives of the Massachusetts Bureau of Labor Statistics. Mary O'Connor, an Irish immigrant who had worked at the mill from 1897 to 1900, described conditions that would horrify modern audiences. 16-hour workdays, no safety equipment, and wages so low that entire families had to work just to afford basic housing. The young Mr. Blackwood, he was different from his father, O'Connor had told investigators in 1900. He would come through the mill sometimes and ask us about our work, about our families. He seemed genuinely troubled by what he saw. More workers corroborated O'Connor's account. Thomas had begun documenting safety violations and wage theft, apparently preparing some kind of formal complaint or exposé. Several workers mentioned that he had promised to use his position to help them find justice. Dr. Warren discovered the specific incident that had likely precipitated Thomas's commitment. In July 1899, a fire had broken out in the mill's cotton storage area. While no one was seriously injured, the incident had revealed that the building lacked adequate fire exits and safety equipment. Thomas had apparently threatened to report these violations to state labor inspectors unless his father implemented immediate improvements. Catherine found Thomas's own documentation of the fire incident in a collection of papers that had somehow survived in the Danvers State Hospital archives. His careful notes and sketches showed blocked emergency exits, faulty electrical wiring, and overcrowded work areas that violated existing safety codes. He had enough evidence to shut down the mill, Catherine realized. No wonder his father was desperate to stop him. The anonymous letters to the Salem Evening News, which had stopped when Thomas was institutionalized, had been building public pressure for an investigation of the mill. Without Thomas's insider knowledge and documentation, the reform movement had collapsed, and working conditions had remained unchanged for years. The reflection in the crystal vase represented more than just a family tragedy. It was the silencing of a voice that had tried to speak for hundreds of exploited workers. Catherine's research into Thomas Blackwood's years at Danvers State Hospital revealed a tragedy compounded by institutional indifference and family cruelty. Hospital records showed that Thomas had repeatedly petitioned for release, claiming he had been wrongfully committed, but his requests were systematically denied based on his family's continued insistence that he remained dangerous. Dr. Morrison's medical notes painted a picture of a man slowly breaking down under the weight of injustice. Initial entries described Thomas as hopeful and determined to prove his sanity, but over time, the isolation and despair began to take their toll. By 1902, Morrison noted that Thomas had become withdrawn and apathetic, showing signs of institutional depression. The irony is heartbreaking, Dr. Warren observed. Thomas was committed for allegedly being mentally ill, but the commitment itself was driving him toward actual mental illness. Catherine found evidence that Thomas had tried to maintain contact with the mill workers he had been trying to help. Several letters in the hospital files showed that workers had attempted to visit him or send messages, but the Blackwood family had instructed hospital administrators to block all communication with former mill employees. One letter, from Mary O'Connor to Thomas in December 1900, had been intercepted by hospital staff and never delivered. Dear Mr. Thomas, we have not forgotten your kindness to us. The conditions at the mill are worse than ever since you've been away. We pray every day that you will return to help us again. The most devastating discovery was a letter from Thomas to his younger brother Robert, written in 1903 but never sent. In it, Thomas wrote, "I no longer fight to prove my sanity, for I fear that this place has indeed driven me mad. I dream of the workers at Father's mill, and I wake knowing I have failed them completely. Perhaps it is better that I remain here, where I can harm no one else with my idealistic foolishness." Catherine traced what had happened to the mill workers after Thomas's silencing. Without his advocacy, working conditions had deteriorated further. A devastating fire in 1904 had killed 12 workers, including Mary O'Connor. The subsequent investigation revealed all the safety violations Thomas had documented 5 years earlier, violations that could have been corrected if his warnings had been heeded instead of suppressed. Thomas had lived at Danvers State Hospital until 1907, when he died of pneumonia at age 32. Hospital records showed that no family members attended his funeral, and he was buried in an unmarked grave in the institution's cemetery. The crystal vase had captured not just Thomas's exclusion from a family photograph, but the moment when his voice was silenced forever, a voice that might have saved the lives of the workers who died in the 1904 fire. As Catherine delved deeper into the Blackwood family's subsequent history, she discovered that Thomas's institutionalization had been just the beginning of a decades-long effort to erase him from family memory entirely. The conspiracy to silence him had extended far beyond his death, affecting how his story was preserved, or rather, deliberately obscured, for future generations. After Thomas's death in 1907, the family had systematically removed all traces of his existence from their home and records. Catherine found evidence of this deliberate erasure in the inventory records from Charles Blackwood's estate, filed after his death in 1912. Items listed as destroyed per family instructions included numerous photographs, personal papers, and even furniture from Thomas's bedroom. The 1899 Christmas photograph had survived only because it had been stored separately with Eleanor Blackwood's personal effects, and the family apparently hadn't noticed Thomas's reflection in the crystal vase when they conducted their purge of his memory. Dr. Warren discovered that the Blackwood family's efforts to rewrite history had included bribing officials to alter public records. Census documents, school records, and even church registries had been modified to minimize or eliminate references to Thomas. In some cases, he was listed simply as deceased in childhood, while in others, his name was completely removed from family listings. The mill fire of 1904, which had killed 12 workers and vindicated Thomas's safety concerns, had been covered up through a combination of media manipulation and legal maneuvering. Catherine found evidence that Charles Blackwood had paid substantial sums to newspaper editors to minimize coverage of the tragedy and to avoid any mention of the previous safety warnings. More disturbing was the discovery that the Blackwood family had actively intimidated survivors and families of victims who tried to speak about the preventable nature of the fire. Several former workers had attempted to give testimony about Thomas's earlier warnings, but they were threatened with job loss and legal action if they continued to speak publicly. Catherine found a particularly chilling document in the records of the Blackwood family attorney, a list of potential problem witnesses regarding the mill fire, with notes about how each had been handled through threats, bribes, or legal pressure. Mary O'Connor's name appeared on the list with the notation, "Matter resolved permanently." She had died in the fire just days before she was scheduled to give testimony to state investigators. The crystal vase reflection had preserved evidence of a conspiracy that had extended decades beyond Thomas's death, affecting the lives of hundreds of workers and their families. The Blackwood family had successfully buried not just Thomas's story, but the truth about their responsibility for the deaths that followed his silencing. Catherine's investigation had uncovered not just the identity of the mysterious figure in the crystal vase, but evidence of a century-old conspiracy that had cost numerous lives. She felt a moral obligation to ensure that Thomas Blackwood's story, and the stories of the workers who had died because his warnings were ignored, would finally be told. Working with Dr. Warren and local historians, Catherine organized a comprehensive exhibition at the Salem Historical Society titled Hidden in Plain Sight: The Thomas Blackwood Story and the 1904 Mill Fire Tragedy. The centerpiece was the enhanced 1899 family photograph with detailed explanations of how the crystal vase reflection had revealed Thomas's presence and led to the uncovering of the conspiracy. The exhibition included documentation of Thomas's attempts to improve working conditions, the legal conspiracy that resulted in his wrongful commitment, and the direct connection between his silencing and the deaths of workers in the 1904 fire. For many visitors, it was their first exposure to the harsh realities of industrial working conditions in turn-of-the-century New England. The response from the community was overwhelming. Descendants of mill workers came forward with family stories that had been passed down through generations, stories of a young, wealthy man who had tried to help them, and whose disappearance had left them defenseless against exploitation. Catherine was able to locate Thomas Blackwood's unmarked grave at the former Danvers State Hospital site, and organized a proper memorial service. Over 200 people attended, including descendants of mill workers whose lives had been affected by Thomas's silencing. A granite headstone was erected bearing the inscription, Thomas Charles Blackwood, 1875-1907. He spoke for those who had no voice. The Massachusetts Department of Labor created a historical marker at the site of the former textile mill, commemorating both the workers who died in the 1904 fire and Thomas Blackwood's efforts to prevent the tragedy. The marker includes an image of the 1899 photograph, with an explanation of how the crystal vase reflection had preserved evidence of an attempt to suppress worker safety advocacy. Dr. Warren used the case as the foundation for a scholarly book about the intersection of mental health stigma and labor suppression in Victorian America. Her research helped establish Thomas Blackwood as an early example of whistleblower persecution, decades before such terms existed. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the impact on the Blackwood descendants. Several family members came forward to express their horror at learning the truth about Thomas's fate and their ancestors' actions. They established a scholarship fund for workers' safety advocacy in Thomas's name and donated the crystal vase, the very artifact that had preserved evidence of the conspiracy, to the Salem Historical Society's permanent collection. Catherine kept a copy of the enhanced photograph in her workshop, a reminder that sometimes the most important historical truths are hidden in the smallest details. Thomas Blackwood's reflection in a crystal vase had waited 124 years to tell his story, but justice, however delayed, had finally been served.